The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in a jar. Margaret Walsh hadn't slept in 34 hours, but her hands were steady as she inserted the 4 on her third attempt, no, her first attempt. The needle slid in clean. O2 sat climbing. 100%. She'd been at Sacred Heart for 8 months now, and nobody knew her name beyond the name tag clipped to her scrubs. Just M. Walsh RN. Just another night nurse pushing a cart through the ICU hallway at 2 in the morning, favoring her left leg slightly, her graying hair pulled back so tight it made her scalp ache. She liked it that way. The smell of antiseptic mixed with something older, copper and iodine, and the ghost of old blood that never quite washed out of the walls. Margaret knew that smell. She'd known it for 23 years. She pushed the thought down the same way she'd learned to push down everything else, methodically, completely, with the precision of someone who understood compartmentalize and the way other people understood breathing. Her locker was in the basement, past the supply room, behind a stack of old cardiac monitors. Inside, beneath her street clothes and a half-empty bottle of ibuprofen, sat a pair of combat boots. Desert tan. Laces gone stiff from sand that still hadn't completely shaken loose from the treads. Ramadi clung to those boots the way ghosts cling to the living, invisible to everyone but the person carrying them. The chart she'd filled out on the Trauma 3 admission at 01 for 5 hours was still sitting on the nurse's station desk when Dr. Hargrove swept past at 6 in the morning, trailing a cloud of expensive cologne. His eye skimmed across it the way his eye skimmed across most things that didn't directly concern him, quickly, thoroughly, without actually seeing anything. Margaret was restocking the medication cart when she felt the shift in air pressure, the way a room changed when someone with institutional power walked through it. His presence made the fluorescent lights seem dimmer. Not because of physics. Because of hierarchy. Morning rounds, he announced to no one in particular, his voice calibrated to carry authority without sounding like he was trying. 3 residents and a student nurse trailed behind him like satellites, their badges catching the overhead light. They didn't look at Margaret. Nobody ever looked at Margaret. She was the kind of woman who blended into hospital corridors the way shadows blend into walls, present but not seen, efficient but not remarkable, a pair of hands that charted meticulously and never made mistakes because mistakes meant liability, and Margaret understood liability the way she understood triage. But Hargrove glanced at her chart that morning. Just a glance. His eyes stopped moving for a fraction of a second, and Margaret felt it the way a predator feels when another predator has caught its scent on the wind. She'd flagged a discrepancy the night before. In the post-op notes for cardiac surgery 347B, the billing had listed 17 units of surgical gauze at $200 per unit. Sacred Heart's actual inventory showed 3 units used. The difference wasn't an accident. It was arithmetic. It was a pattern. Margaret had worked supply chain logistics in her previous life, though nobody at Sacred Heart knew she'd had a previous life, and she'd noticed the pattern immediately: the gauze, the arterial lines, the bone marrow needles, all overcharged, all split between the facility code and a separate vendor account registered to something called Meridian Medical Solutions LLC. She documented it. That was the problem. That was always going to be the problem. Hargrove didn't say anything when he looked at her chart. He just moved past, his white coat crisp as military dress blues, his stethoscope draped around his neck like a medallion. But something had shifted. Margaret felt it the way she felt everything now, not in her conscious mind but in the ancient part of her brain that had learned to recognize danger the way other people recognized their children's faces. The night shift started at 7 in the evening. Margaret arrived in the parking lot at 6:45, the San Diego sun still high enough to cast sharp shadows. She walked with that slight limp, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for, which nobody did. Her scrubs were pressed. Her badge was clipped exactly 2 inches below her collarbone. Her hands, when she pulled them out of her pocket, were steady as surgical instruments. The ICU was quiet when she logged in. Quieter than usual. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless song, and the monitors beeped their rhythmic confirmation that everyone was still breathing, still alive, still technically salvageable. Margaret moved through the space like she was moving through water, efficient, methodical, her eyes catching details that other nurses missed. She noted the edema on patient 4's left ankle, the slight yellow tint to the sclera on patient 6's eyes, the way the oxygen saturation on patient 2 was trending down 1% every 6 minutes. Pain was information. Her hands knew that before her mind registered the thought. The admission came through at 0200 hours exactly. Ambulance inbound. Trauma case. Admitted directly to Trauma 3. Margaret was taking vitals on a post-op surgical patient when the commotion started, the radio static, the urgent voices, the way the entire ICU shifted into a gear that nobody but medical professionals ever heard. Boots on tile. Rapid footsteps. The stretcher squeaked as they wheeled it through the double doors. She didn't look up from her work. That was part of her training. That was part of the anonymity she'd paid for with 8 months of keeping her head down and her past wrapped around her like bandages that might unravel if she moved too fast. But the name came through on the assignment board, and Margaret's hands went completely still for exactly 3 seconds. Commander James Riker. Navy SEAL. Admitted with penetrating thoracic trauma, possible tension pneumothorax, respiratory distress, blood pressure 87/52 and dropping. Her son's commanding officer. The one person in this hospital who could unravel everything she'd built by simply looking at her face and remembering her voice from briefings 3 years ago. Her jaw tightened. Once. That was all the reaction she allowed herself. She finished recording the vital signs, BP 147/89, heart rate 101, O2 sat 98%, and moved toward Trauma 3 without hurrying, without breaking protocol, without giving anyone a reason to notice anything except a competent night nurse responding to an admission. Riker was conscious when she entered the room. His eyes were alert despite the pain, that particular brand of military clarity that came from having already faced death multiple times and decided not to be impressed by it. His chest was asymmetrical, the right side rising and falling with normal respiration, the left side barely moving at all. Tension pneumothorax. Air in the pleural cavity. The pressure building with every breath. Margaret didn't flinch. Flinching was for people who still had normal nervous systems, and Margaret's nervous system had been rewired in Ramadi in 2011 and never quite put back together the right way. She moved to the bedside with the practiced grace of someone who'd done this exact thing in field hospitals surrounded by rocket fire and the screams of men whose bodies had been broken into teaching moments. "I'm going to place a chest catheter," she said quietly, keeping her eyes on the monitors instead of Riker's face. "The air needs to come out. You'll feel relief when it releases." His eyes were on her. She could feel them. Searching. Trying to place her. She was 62 now, with lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when he was a young petty officer first class in her command, and her hair had gone grey at the temples, and she moved with the careful economy of someone who'd learned that every motion had consequences. She was unrecognizable. That had been the entire point. She gathered the supplies with hands that could have been ice. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Sterile field. The point of insertion at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The spot where air escapes and lungs re-expand and the body remembers how to breathe without fighting for every oxygen molecule. She was positioning herself when Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway, his presence entering the room ahead of him like a pressure wave. He watched her for exactly 14 seconds before he stepped closer. She could feel his eyes on her hands, the way they moved with mechanical precision, the way she'd already cleaned the insertion site, the way she was handling the needle like she'd done this before. Like she'd done this many, many times. In places where textbooks didn't teach you and protocols meant the difference between saving a life and explaining why a soldier's body came home in a flag-draped box. "I'll take it from here," Hargrove said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected obedience. Margaret stepped back immediately, her face blank, her posture already deferential. Just a night nurse. Just someone who cleaned up charts and followed protocols and knew better than to develop opinions about her superiors. But she'd seen him watching her hands. She'd seen the moment when he realized that whatever this quiet woman was, she wasn't a typical hospital nurse trained on YouTube videos and continuing education seminars. And in that moment, Margaret understood that Dr. Hargrove had already begun calculating how to protect himself. She moved to the monitor station and pretended to focus on the numbers: heart rate 127, blood pressure 79/51, oxygen saturation 68 and falling. The numbers were talking to her in a language that transcended hospital administration and kickback schemes and the careful architecture of plausible deniability. The numbers were screaming that if someone didn't intervene in the next 90 seconds, Commander James Riker's body was going to shut down. Hargrove was still positioning himself. Margaret kept her hands on the edge of the counter and watched the digits drop. 67, 66. 65, the hiss of a failing respiratory system. The sound of pressure building in a space where no air should exist. She was going on break after this shift. She needed Jell-O. She needed to sit in her car in a hospital parking lot and remember how to breathe like a person instead of a ghost. But first, she had to find a way to save a man without revealing that she knew exactly how to do it. During family visiting hours on day 2 of Commander Riker's admission, Dr. Hargrove called Margaret into the patient room. Riker's wife sat in the vinyl chair beside the bed, her hands gripping the armrest. Their 2 teenagers stood near the window, the boy maybe 17, the girl younger, both watching Margaret with the careful attention of people who'd learned to read rooms. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. Antiseptic and coffee and something else, the particular smell of fear sweat, which Margaret recognized from 2 decades of watching families fracture under bad news. Hargrove stood at the foot of the bed, his tie still perfectly knotted at 2 in the afternoon, his hands holding Margaret's shift reports like a prosecutor holding evidence. "Nurse Walsh," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut, "explain to this family why your charting errors show supply charges that don't match my surgical notes." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned the page deliberately, making sure they all saw the red circles he'd drawn in the margins. These discrepancies could get this hospital sued into oblivion. Perhaps you'd like to tell them how your incompetence might cost them their husband and father. Margaret stood perfectly still in the doorway. She took one measured breath through her nose. Riker's wife's face had gone pale, the color draining like someone had opened a valve. The boy stepped forward an inch, a protective movement, instinctive. Margaret said nothing. She had learned years ago that silence was a weapon only when you knew exactly when to use it, and this wasn't the moment. "Not yet." Hargrove continued, his voice dropping into a tone of mock concern. "I've reviewed your file, Walsh. Bottom-tier nursing school, no specialty certifications, barely adequate performance reviews. I'm starting to wonder if you're even qualified for basic floor work." He turned to Riker's wife. "I want to assure you that we're investigating her thoroughly. This kind of carelessness endangers patients." A single tear escaped down Margaret's left cheek. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Hargrove. The movement was precise, controlled, the gesture of someone who understood that tears were data, information to be managed like vitals. Her voice came out quiet enough that Riker's wife had to lean forward to hear it. "I've seen men with more integrity bleed out in the sand than you'll ever possess in your entire career." The room went silent. Not the comfortable silence of understanding. The shocked silence of someone saying what wasn't supposed to be said, the kind of silence that lives in the space between obedience and mutiny. Hargrove's jaw tightened. His face flushed the color of raw liver. He opened his mouth and closed it again, and in that moment Margaret could see him calculating, recalibrating, deciding whether this insubordination was worth addressing or worth weaponizing. He chose the latter. His smile came back, thin and sharp as a scalpel. "Thank you for demonstrating exactly my point," he said to the room. Then to Margaret, "You're done here. There will be formal documentation of this conduct." Margaret turned and walked out. She didn't close the door quietly. She didn't close it loudly. She closed it the way a person closes a door when they have nothing left to prove to anyone, and that was somehow worse than anything else she could have done. Behind her, she heard Riker's wife ask softly, "What was that about?" and Hargrove's smooth reply beginning to reshape the narrative, to make himself the victim and Margaret the threat. The break room the next afternoon was a lesson in social architecture. Margaret sat down at the small table with her coffee, black, no sugar, the same way she'd drunk it in the hooch at FOB Shank 17 years ago, and watched the physics of her banishment happen in real time. 4 nurses occupied the table. 3 of them stood within 10 seconds of her sitting down. Not quickly enough to seem panicked, but quickly enough that everyone watching would understand the message. The 4th nurse, a resident named Chen who'd only been on the unit for 2 months, looked between Margaret and the departing staff with visible confusion, then anxiety, then compliance. She stood too, her tray half finished, and followed them to the far corner of the break room. They whispered. Margaret could hear them without listening. The younger ones, the float pool nurses who depended on good performance reviews, they avoided eye contact when they had to pass the sink near Margaret's table. The older nurses, the ones with 20 years of tenure, they looked at her with something like pity mixed with fear, the look people give to wounded animals that might still bite. One of them, Susan from day shift, made actual eye contact and gave the smallest shake of her head. Not judgment. Warning. By 1400 hours, Margaret saw it. A formal write-up posted on the unit disciplinary board in the main hallway outside the medication room. The board was designed to be seen, positioned at exactly the height where anyone retrieving supplies would have to read the bright yellow paper affixed with a laminated marker that said Staff Conduct Notice. Her name was printed in bold uppercase, M. Walsh RN. Below it, in clinical language that somehow made the humiliation worse than if it had been crude, failure to follow protocol, insubordination to attending physician, unprofessional conduct. Staff members slowed as they passed it. Margaret watched them slow. A respiratory therapist shook his head. One of the orthopedic nurses actually smirked, a real smirk that showed teeth. Someone had drawn a small arrow pointing to the notice and written in ballpoint pen, "Tell her how you feel." The handwriting was childish, high school bathroom graffiti energy, which somehow made it worse than careful cruelty would have been. Margaret walked past it twice during her shift. Her limp was slightly more pronounced, not from pain, but from a kind of exhaustion that lived in the bones. Her jaw was set in the way that made the small scar on her chin more visible, a line of pale skin against sun-bronzed face that had nothing to do with San Diego summers and everything to do with a combat surgical team in Ramadi working by flashlight in a building that was bleeding faster than they could patch it. In the medication room at 1545 hours, she overheard 2 residents laughing near the automated dispensary. Their voices had that edge of nervousness that came from knowing they might be overheard but not caring enough to stop talking. Hargrove called her nurse Ratched without the competence, the taller one said. "I heard he's got Chen doing a peer review. She's done within 6 months." The other resident laughed, a sound like gravel in a drain. Probably should have known better than to question his surgical notes. Guy's got connections. Margaret pulled a vial of morphine from the dispenser. She didn't turn around. She didn't acknowledge them. But something in her breathing changed, became more deliberate, more controlled, the way an animal's breathing changes right before it decides to move. The residents felt it. They stopped talking. One of them muttered something about needing to check on a patient, and they left. The medication room fell quiet except for the mechanical hum of the refrigeration unit and the distant beeping of monitors from the patient floors. Her hands didn't tremble. That wasn't how Margaret's nervous system worked anymore. Instead, her hands became very still, very precise, the steadiness of someone who had learned long ago that trembling got people killed. She finished her medication pass with the kind of perfection that bordered on obsessive. Every foresight documented. Every patient's pupils checked and recorded. Every cardiac rhythm interpreted and noted. If Hargrove wanted charting errors, he was going to have to look much harder than he already had. At 1800 hours, Margaret went to her locker in the nurse's station. She'd avoided opening it since the write-up appeared, avoiding the moment when she'd have to acknowledge that her private space, the small metal box that held her identification badge and her car keys and the one personal item she allowed herself, was now contaminated by association. She turned the combination slowly. 17-34-9, the date she'd left active duty. Inside, wrapped in newspaper yellowed at the edges, were her combat boots. Battered leather the color of old bone. a stitched seam on the left sole that had been repaired 3 times. Sand still caught in the laces if you looked closely enough, Ramady sand, the kind that got into everything and never quite came out. Dust on the boots, dust on your uniform, dust on the idea that you could ever be clean again. She stared at them for a long moment. Her reflection stared back from the small mirror affixed to the inside of the locker door, the one she used to check her appearance before shifts. What looked back was a woman with eyes that had seen too much, eyes that belonged to someone who'd already lived 3 lifetimes before she turned 38, eyes that didn't belong in a hospital in San Diego trying to be someone she wasn't. The woman in the reflection didn't flinch when she heard footsteps approaching. She didn't close the locker. She simply waited, the way she'd waited in ambush positions in Ramady while the city bled its sounds into the dark. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what came next, what Hargrove was already setting in motion during those hours when Margaret was trying to remember how to breathe like a person instead of a ghost. He'd activated his network. He'd made calls. 18 hours after the write-up appeared on the disciplinary board, Hargrove was in his private office, the one with the mahogany desk and the framed surgical photos on the walls, the before and afters of his reconstructive work, the cases that made him money, and he was making phone calls. The first was to Dr. Patricia Chen, a board member at Sacred Heart, a woman who'd referred approximately 40 surgical cases to Hargrove's private practice over the last 3 years, referrals that generated approximately $320,000 in professional fees. The kind of money that bought loyalty. The kind of money that ensured a particular kind of reciprocal favor when requested. "Patricia," Hargrove said, his voice smooth as warm oil, "I need your help with a peer review." "Expedited. One of my nurses is documenting discrepancies that don't exist. I'm concerned about a pattern of insubordination that could expose the hospital." There was a pause on the other end. "Then, what kind of pattern?" "The kind that requires investigation," he said. "I'd appreciate it if we could move this through your committee within 48 hours. Before she contaminates any more charts." He hung up and made a second call. This one to St. Mary's Hospital in Phoenix, where Margaret had worked during that gap in her employment history, that period she'd left vague on her Sacred Heart application. A hospital administrator named Robert Kellerman, a man who owed Hargrove a significant consulting fee from a malpractice defense case 2 years prior. A man who understood the economics of reciprocal favors. "Robert, I'm looking into an employee's background. Previously worked at St. Mary's. Margaret Walsh. RN. I'm hoping you can clarify some gaps in her employment history. Any concerns when she worked there?" Hargrove listened. He made notes. He shaped the narrative with the precision of someone who'd learned that questions asked a certain way received answers that could be reinterpreted however you needed them to be. By the time he hung up, he had 7 hours of phone calls scheduled. 7 separate people who owed him something. 7 separate ways to ensure that Margaret Walsh's credibility was dismantled from multiple angles simultaneously. He was competent before he was desperate. That was what made him dangerous. He wasn't a man who screamed or threatened. He was a man who understood institutional power, who'd spent his career learning how to move through hierarchies like a knife through silk, who knew exactly which threads to pull to unravel a person's entire professional existence. Margaret had no idea what was already in motion. She had no idea that by the time she walked out of her shift, a patient safety investigator named Donald Reese was already opening his briefcase in the hospital administrator's office, already being briefed on her case, already reviewing the charts that Hargrove had carefully curated. She had no idea what the next 72 hours would bring. Donald Reese arrived at Sacred Heart Hospital on a Tuesday morning carrying a leather briefcase that smelled like dry cleaning and expensive aftershave. He was a patient safety investigator, the kind of consultant hospitals called when they needed to make someone disappear quietly. Dr. Hargrove had made the introduction sound clinical. "We have concerns about scope of practice violations. Potentially dangerous patterns." What Reese didn't know was that the patterns were Margaret's precision, and the violations were her competence bleeding through a costume of invisibility. The briefcase contained nothing but blank forms, a recording device, and a pre-written conclusion. Hargrove had been thorough. That same Tuesday, he placed calls to Margaret's previous employer at Naval Hospital Camp Lejeune, calls that sounded concerned, professional, institutional. "I'm verifying employment for a current staff member," he told the credentials office. Margaret Walsh. 8 months here. Her charting is meticulous, almost surgical. Wondering if there were any concerns during her tenure with you. The administrator, a woman Hargrove had met at a medical conference 3 years prior, paused just long enough to plant doubt. Her credentials were solid, she said carefully. But there were questions about judgment calls. Nothing we could prove. "Why do you ask?" Hargrove didn't answer directly. He didn't need to. The seed was planted. Within hours, Reese had the call forwarded to him, already colored with innuendo, already weaponized into suspicion. Margaret didn't know any of this yet. She was working nights, moving through Sacred Heart's dimly lit corridors with the practiced efficiency of someone trying to disappear into the job. The fluorescent panels overhead cast everything in a sickly pale blue. Monitors beeped their mechanical rhythm down the ICU hallway. Her badge hung from her neck, the red lanyard stark against her dark scrubs, a small flag announcing her presence to anyone watching. She was changing 4 bags in room for 12 when the charge nurse appeared in the doorway. Walsh. Administrator's office. Now. No explanation. No eye contact. Just the kind of summons that makes the air pressure change in a hospital. Everyone around you suddenly remembers urgent tasks elsewhere. The office was on the 3rd floor. Beige walls. Mahogany desk. The kind of room designed to make you feel small. Hargrove was already seated, his fingers steepled on the desk like a man praying to his own intelligence. Next to him sat Donald Reese, his suit perfectly pressed, his smile like a wolf showing its teeth. He introduced himself as a patient outcome specialist and explained, with the kind of measured tone that made everything sound reasonable, that the hospital had initiated a standard review of her recent work. "Nothing to be alarmed about," he said. "Just procedure. We've identified some charting anomalies. Some decisions that might warrant clarification." Margaret stood. She didn't sit, didn't apologize, didn't ask for a union rep. She simply stood and waited, her jaw clenching once, just once, before she forced it to relax. "Your assessments are unusually detailed," Reese continued, sliding a chart across the desk. It was her note from 3 weeks prior, documenting subtle signs of compartment syndrome in a post-op orthopedic patient. The resident had missed it. Margaret had caught it, flagged it, and the patient received emergency fasciotomy at 2 a.m. The patient walked out of the hospital for days later. Reese's pen circled the exact sentence: asymmetrical swelling, skin turgor diminished, capillary refill delayed beyond normal parameters. His eyebrow rose slightly. "This is thorough. Unusually thorough for a floor nurse. Did you receive additional training?" The question was a trap disguised as curiosity. Any answer that included military medical experience would validate Hargrove's narrative of overstepping scope. Any denial would make her look dishonest. Margaret didn't take the bait. "I was thorough because the patient needed me to be." 10 words. The way she said it, flat, certain, without defense, made something flicker across Reese's face. He wasn't expecting composure. He was expecting fear. But that wasn't what Hargrove had paid him for. Over the next 72 hours, the attack became surgical. Reese reviewed every single chart Margaret had touched in the past 8 months. He found patterns, not of negligence, but of excellence so consistent it looked suspicious. He interviewed the ICU nurses, the respiratory therapists, the surgical team. Most spoke highly of her. But Reese had been trained to translate praise into paranoia. She's always the one who catches things first. Translation: she's stepping outside her role. The doctors trust her assessments. Translation: she's overstepping her scope of practice. She knows more than she should. Translation: she's a liability. By Thursday morning, a formal complaint had been filed. It arrived in Margaret's locker, printed on hospital letterhead, dated and signed by Hargrove and countersigned by the compliance officer, a man Hargrove had golfed with twice and had invited to the hospital's next board gala. The complaint alleged pattern of performing assessments consistent with advanced practice nursing without licensure or authorization. It recommended immediate suspension pending investigation. The hospital would cover all shifts. Her access badge would be deactivated by end of business. There would be no pay during the investigation. No timeline for resolution. Margaret read it once. Then read it again. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Around her, the locker room felt smaller, the industrial lights more harsh, the smell of antiseptic more acrid. Another nurse hurried past, suddenly focused on her own locker, suddenly unable to make eye contact. The isolation had a sound, the absence of conversation, the deliberate ignoring of her presence. This was the moment when she understood that Hargrove hadn't just attacked her credibility. He'd networked the attack through the entire hospital, and Sacred Heart's institutional machinery had begun crushing her with the efficiency of a machine designed exactly for this purpose. She changed out of her scrubs mechanically. Clinical. Efficient. The same focus she'd used in field hospitals in Ramadi when incoming fire made every decision lethal. Her locker was sparse, extra scrubs, a hairbrush, some lip balm. But at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic bag she'd kept there since her first day, were her combat boots. They were worn past their warranty, the leather cracked from desert heat, the sole separating from the heel on the left side. She'd kept them for 8 months without opening the bag, without acknowledging why. They were from Forward Operating Base Shank in Logar Province. They were from a night when she'd been awake for 37 straight hours and had saved the life of a Navy interpreter named Khalid whose brother had been bleeding out on her table. They were evidence. They were home. They were proof of who she actually was. She held the boots in one hand and the suspension letter in the other, and for a moment, just a moment, she let herself feel the weight of both. The drive to her apartment took 18 minutes. Her hands gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2, the way they taught you in the academy. Rain began hammering the windshield like applause nobody asked for. San Diego didn't get rain often. When it came with violence. She pulled into the parking garage of her building at 3:11 p.m., the numbers clicking on the digital clock like a countdown to something she couldn't stop. Her apartment was exactly as she'd left it, sparse, organized, deliberately forgettable. A bed. A kitchenette with nothing but coffee, oatmeal, and canned fish. A single chair by a window. A television she never turned on. The only thing that violated her minimalism was the pile of papers on her kitchen table, discharge documents, still in their original envelope, still unopened since the day she'd received them. She set the combat boots on the counter and opened the envelope. The letterhead read Walter Reed Medical Center. The date was March 14th, 2 years prior. The diagnosis was PTSD, severe, with documented intrusive memories, hypervigilance, and symptoms consistent with traumatic brain injury secondary to repeated blast exposure. The recommended treatment plan included 6 months of cognitive processing therapy, psychiatric medication, and structured reintegration protocol. There was a line at the bottom where the attending psychiatrist had written, patient reports nightmares approximately 4 to 5 times weekly. Symptoms consistent with 19 documented combat deployments. Recommend medical discharge and civilian job placement with minimal stress environment. Patient declined inpatient treatment. Margaret had declined. She'd walked out of Walter Reed on a spring morning and hadn't looked back. She'd liquidated her military retirement account, paid the penalties, and disappeared into San Diego's anonymity. She'd gotten her civilian nursing license, changed her first name officially from Margaret to just the initial M on her work badge, and taken a job on the night shift where she could work alone and come home to silence. She'd kept the discharge papers sealed in a drawer because reading them meant accepting that the nightmares were real, that the trembling hands had a diagnosis, that the Ramadi market explosions and Khalid's brother's blood on her uniform and the 40-hour surgeries in 120-degree heat had cost her something that couldn't be refunded. She'd never told her son where she'd gone. Not a single word about the discharge, the diagnosis, the 8 months she'd spent in a hospital bed trying to convince doctors she could live in a world without explosions. He was now a petty officer first class stationed in San Diego, which meant proximity she deliberately engineered so she could be near him without being in his life. Their relationship was a series of text messages and one awkward dinner she'd almost cancelled. The rain continued outside her window. Street lights reflected off wet asphalt. Somewhere in the city, Dr. Hargrove was probably having a drink, already confident in his victory. The suspension would hold for the required 30-day investigation period. By then, the hospital's culture would have absorbed Reese's narrative. Margaret Walsh was ambitious, overstepping, possibly delusional about her qualifications. Hargrove's billing scheme would continue undetected. The surgical supply inflation would keep feeding the distributor's margin. Everything would continue exactly as planned. But what Hargrove didn't know was that at 4:17 p.m. that Thursday afternoon, while Margaret was staring at her discharge papers in her silent apartment, an ICU nurse named Patricia Rodriguez was sending a text message to a contact she shouldn't have had. Patricia's husband was active Navy. Patricia's brother had been a corpsman in Iraq. Patricia had worked with enough military medical personnel to recognize when someone was carrying classified credentials. She'd noticed Margaret's hospital core tattoo once, months ago, when Margaret had rolled up her sleeve during a code. She'd noticed the way Margaret's hands moved during emergencies, not like a civilian nurse improvising, but like someone executing muscle memory from 1,000 repetitions under fire. She'd noticed the way Margaret's voice dropped to exactly the frequency that made people listen. Patricia sent a message to Commander James Riker's direct line: "Your ICU nurse is being suspended. The attending physician creating the problem. You need to know that she saved your life, and she did it before your wife even knew you were in the building." 3 days later, the text would arrive at a secure Pentagon inbox. 3 days later, the silence would fall across Sacred Heart like a guillotine. 3 days later, Margaret would make a choice that would transform her from invisible to unforgettable. But that night, in her apartment, she didn't know any of that yet. She only knew that her boots were on the counter, her discharge papers were in her hands, and the nightmares had finally found her again after 2 years of running. She sat in her single chair by the window and watched the rain and waited for the next 72 hours to change everything. The rain hammered the parking lot like applause as Margaret pulled into the Sacred Heart employee entrance at 0300 hours. Her hands gripped the steering wheel with the controlled tension of someone who'd learned long ago that fear was just another vital sign to manage. 3 days of suspension papers. 3 days of her badge deactivated, her access revoked, her name on every disciplinary bulletin board like a scarlet letter. She used the unmarked side entrance where the night maintenance staff rarely checked credentials, climbing 3 flights of concrete stairs instead of risking the elevators with their security cameras and recorded timestamps. Her left leg screamed with every step, the prosthetic reminding her of exactly what she'd sacrificed the first time she saved a life under fire. Room 312. She moved through the supply corridor like smoke, the kind of invisible that came from 8 months of studying every camera angle, every staff rotation, every gap in the night shift's attention. The ICU was dim and humming, ventilators breathing for people whose bodies had forgotten how. Commander Riker's room glowed under fluorescent panels that cast his face the color of old concrete. His chest was wrong. Asymmetrical. The right side expanded while the left collapsed inward with each desperate breath. His trachea had shifted left like a needle pointing toward danger. Neck veins distended and purple. Jugular venous pressure climbing. The night resident stood at the foot of the bed, phone in hand, waiting for radiology to call him back. Waiting. Always waiting. Margaret moved past him without a word, her movements precise as a machine, her mind already calculating. 14-gauge needle. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The crash cart sat 3 feet away. She was there and back in 5 seconds, the needle already prepped, her fingers finding Riker's anatomy with the certainty of hands that had done this in a burning Humvee while artillery thundered overhead. 1 breath. 2. She palpated the landmark, felt the yielding space between ribs, and pressed forward with the kind of decisiveness that only comes from having already watched someone die from indecision. The needle went in. The hiss of escaping air was immediate and beautiful, the sound of pressure release, of death being cheated, of physics surrendering to will. Riker's oxygen saturation climbed, 82 to 87 to 91. His breathing eased. The panic left his face. 90 seconds. That was all it took. The resident stared at Margaret with the expression of a man who'd just watched a ghost perform surgery. She didn't look at him. She placed the needle exactly where it needed to be and stepped back, and that was when Dr. Hargrove's voice cut through the ICU like a scalpel. His face was purple, not the purple of medical concern but the purple of a man watching his control slip away. "You're suspended. You have no authorization to touch patients. Security. Now." Margaret turned to face him with the kind of calm that comes from knowing you've already survived worse than his rage could ever deliver. She didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. She simply said, "Patient was in tension pneumothorax. Trachea deviated. He was dying. I performed needle decompression. It worked. The facts. Nothing more." Hargrove's jaw clenched so hard she could see the muscle contract beneath his skin. Security arrived in under 2 minutes, not because he'd called them but because he'd keyed his radio like a man losing a war. Margaret didn't resist. She walked out with her hands visible and her head level, and behind her, she heard the resident explaining to Hargrove exactly how long the doctor had stood frozen before Margaret had moved. That detail was now documented. That hesitation was in the chart. That was the moment Hargrove understood he was trapped. Within 6 minutes of Margaret's exit, Hargrove made his first call. Within 40 minutes, he'd contacted the California Board of Registered Nursing with an emergency complaint for practicing while suspended. Within 90 minutes, he'd called 2 board members who owed him favors and filed a formal incident report accusing Margaret of reckless endangerment and scope violation. By 0900 hours, a patient safety investigator named Reese arrived with a file full of surgical supply discrepancies that suddenly had Margaret's name written next to them, a false trail leading directly away from Hargrove's inflation scheme. At 09 for 5 hours, Margaret received her termination papers via courier at her apartment. Immediate dismissal. License review pending. Potential criminal charges for trespassing and unauthorized patient contact. Her security badge was already deactivated. Her locker had been cleared, and someone had left her property in a plastic hospital bag on her doorstep. The combat boots from Ramadi. The ones she'd kept for 12 years and never explained to anyone. She held them in her hands in the doorway of her apartment, the leather worn and salt-stained, and her hands were shaking, not from fear but from the recognition that she'd finally been found. The nightmares she'd been running from had caught up to her, and they had brought reinforcements. She reached for her phone. Her fingers found the VA crisis line she'd saved 3 years ago but never called, the number that represented everything she'd been avoiding. She dialed. 3 days later, Margaret sat in the waiting room of the San Diego VA hospital in La Jolla, surrounded by the visible and invisible wounds of men who'd survived what most people couldn't imagine. Combat amputees. Burn victims. A woman missing an arm, reading a magazine with remarkable focus. A man rocking slightly, his eyes tracking things no one else could see. She recognized faces. Corman Henderson, who'd worked the field hospital in Fallujah. A ranger whose name she couldn't remember but whose shrapnel wounds she'd sutured together in a tent while mortars exploded outside. She filled out the intake form with the deliberation of someone confessing. PTSD diagnosis, yes. Suicidal ideation, not currently. Medications, none. Years since combat, 2. The silence of that number, 2, was louder than any alarm. A wheelchair rolled past, pushed by a young VA volunteer. An Iraqi man in his 60s, dressed in carefully pressed trousers and a button-down shirt. The wheelchair stopped. The man's eyes locked on Margaret's face with the intensity of recognition that transcends language. His mouth opened. He spoke in Arabic first, as if the weight of what he was about to say required the language of home. Jara Kabaira. Then English, his voice cracking, "Senior Chief. You saved my brother. The market bombing in Ramadi. 2006, you held pressure for 40 minutes until the medevac arrived. You stayed with him. The waiting room went silent the way rooms do when something important is being said." Margaret stood. Something shifted in her chest, not trembling but the kind of pressure release that happens when a secret stops being a secret. A Navy corpsman in the corner rose slowly, his eyes widening with the recognition of someone who'd just realized he was standing in the presence of a legend. The sound of boots echoed in the hallway, tactical boots, multiple pairs, moving with the unified precision of trained personnel. Her son appeared first, and his voice broke before his words did, "Mom." Behind him, 6 Navy SEALs in dress uniforms. And leading them, a Master Chief she'd served with in Ramadi, whose name she'd carried in her chest for 2 years like classified intelligence. Someone handed her a file. Commander James Riker's personnel file. Inside was a letter of recommendation dated 4 years earlier, signed in her careful handwriting, Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, United States Navy. 100 people had gathered in the lobby by then, staff, patients, families. A VA doctor stepped forward. His voice was steady and formal. Bronze Star with Valor. Ramadi, 2006. For treating 18 casualties under direct fire while performing emergency medical procedures without evacuation. A chaplain continued, each word hitting like a pulse, Purple Heart. Shrapnel wound sustained during sustained hostile action while refusing medical evacuation. Her son's voice, tears on his face, Combat Action Ribbon. Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. 3 tours. 96 combat saves documented. The Iraqi interpreter spoke again, his English fractured but clear. She lost her legs when the vehicle burned. When the bomb detonated during medevac. She kept working on my brother even as the fire climbed. The prosthetics beneath Margaret's pants weren't hidden anymore. The limp that had been her constant companion was suddenly explained. The exhaustion she carried was visible at last. The Master Chief's voice filled the entire lobby. They called her the Angel of Ramadi. She volunteered for the most dangerous rotations. She saved lives that had been written off. And then the nightmares came home with her. The silence that followed was reverent. Sacred. Then 2 figures moved through the gathered crowd. Federal badges catching the fluorescent light. An FBI agent in a dark suit, and beside him, a woman from the Office of Inspector General. The senior agent's voice cut through the reverence like a knife. "We're investigating healthcare fraud at Sacred Heart Hospital in San Diego. Pattern of inflated surgical supply charges. Kickback scheme with a medical device distributor. Is Margaret Walsh present? We have questions about witness intimidation and retaliation." Margaret stood. The room was silent except for the soft hum of overhead lights and the distant beep of monitors from the ICU beyond. Everything was about to change again. The interpreter's eyes locked onto Margaret's across the polished nurse's station floor, and his mouth moved before his body understood what he was seeing. The wheelchair stopped mid-push. His hand trembled against the armrest. "Senior Chief," he whispered in Arabic, his voice cracking like old leather. "You saved my brother in Ramadi. You saved Karim." The name hung in the air between them, a name Margaret hadn't heard spoken aloud in 2 years, a name attached to a bleeding kid with shrapnel in his femur who'd screamed for his mother in a field hospital where the sand got into everything, even the foresights. Margaret's breath steadied. She didn't look away. The interpreter began to cry, silently, the way combat survivors learn to cry when there was nowhere private to break. Before she could move, footsteps echoed down the corridor. Heavy boots. Deliberate. Her son appeared in the hallway in his dress uniform, the SEAL trident catching fluorescent light like a blade, and for 3 seconds he didn't speak. His jaw worked. His eyes were liquid. When the words came, they came in a formal cadence she recognized from 1,000 briefing rooms and ceremonies where emotion had to be compartmentalized into precise language. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. He said it the way you'd announce someone to the Pentagon. Then his voice fractured. "Mom. What you did. What you've always done." She held his gaze and said nothing, because speaking would have required moving past the threshold she'd maintained for 23 months, and that threshold was all that had kept her upright. In her hand, she was reading his file. And there, in a handwritten note from years ago, in her own precise military penmanship, was the letter of recommendation she'd written for Commander Riker when he was just a junior officer with fire in his eyes and something to prove. She'd forgotten she'd written it. Or maybe she'd spent 2 years trying to forget. The SEAL team commander arrived next, his presence moving through the ICU like a pressure change, like the moment before a storm breaks over the desert. He was tall in the way of men who'd spent their lives carrying other men's weight. His dress uniform bore insignia that made the hospital staff instinctively straighten their spines. He positioned himself across from Margaret with the bearing of someone accustomed to having rooms go silent when he entered. Staff members began to gather. A resident. 2 nurses. The respiratory therapist. The administrator on call. Silence spread through Sacred Heart like contagion. Bronze Star with Valor, the commander said, each word a measured beat. Nurses stared. Margaret's face remained unreadable. Purple Heart. A pause. Another. Combat action ribbon. The administrator's hand went to her mouth. The commander's voice never wavered. He wasn't reading from paper. He was speaking from memory, from briefing books, from service records that had somehow found their way into military channels while Margaret had been pushing a mop and charting vitals. You held the line when it mattered, Senior Chief. You taught us what it means to serve with no witnesses. The silence that followed was complete. It was the kind of silence that occupied space, that had weight and texture. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they were holding their breath. And then the doors to the main corridor burst open. 2 men in dark suits moved with the precision of federal agents, and everyone in the hospital knew what federal agents looked like, the posture, the radio pieces, the way they moved through space like the building belonged to them. Behind them came 2 more, and a woman with a gold badge visible at her waist. The lead agent scanned the ICU until his eyes landed on Dr. Hargrove, who'd materialized in the doorway of the physician's lounge, his face draining of color as though someone had opened a valve in his chest. Dr. Marcus Hargrove, the lead agent called out, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. "We're with the FBI. You're under arrest for healthcare fraud, wire fraud, witness tampering, computer fraud, and falsification of medical records related to an 11-month investigation into Medicare billing irregularities at Sacred Heart Medical Center and 2 affiliated facilities." The agent stepped forward. "You have the right to remain silent." Hargrove's mouth opened. Closed. His eyes found Margaret standing beside the interpreter's wheelchair, beside her son, beside the SEAL commander who looked like he'd personally dragged judgment through the hospital doors. Understanding flooded his face. Not slow understanding. The kind that hits like a defibrillator shock. Margaret had gone to compliance before her suspension. She documented everything. The supply discrepancies. The inflated charges. The pattern that only someone with surgical precision attention to detail would have caught. But it wasn't just Margaret's documentation. The agents had been monitoring his attempts to cover his tracks. He'd panicked when she was suspended. He'd tried to forge her personnel records at 3 in the morning, using a resident's stolen password, hoping to make it appear she'd falsified her credentials, that her testimony could be discredited before it ever reached federal prosecutors. Every keystroke had been recorded. Every fabricated disciplinary action, every forged document, every moment of his desperation had been captured on servers he didn't know were under surveillance. They cuffed him in front of the disciplinary board where he'd humiliated Margaret 72 hours earlier. His medical license was suspended by emergency order before he reached the parking lot. The perp walk through Sacred Heart's main lobby appeared on the 6 o'clock news, Dr. Hargrove in handcuffs, passing the same board where Margaret's failure to follow protocol had been posted for everyone to witness. The medical device distributor was arrested simultaneously. Board members received federal subpoenas. Kickbacks were traced. Accounts frozen. But that wasn't the end of Margaret's story. That was just the threshold. 6 months later, Sacred Heart Hospital held a ceremony in the main atrium where she'd been broken down in front of everyone she worked beside. 200 staff members attended. 50 veterans filled rows of chairs. A contingent of Navy SEALs in dress uniform sat with the kind of stillness that only people trained in perfect discipline could maintain. Margaret stood in her navy dress blues for the first time in 23 months, her prosthetic legs hidden beneath the uniform, her decorations displayed on her chest like a language that made the room finally understand what it had been standing next to all along. Commander Riker presented her with the hospital's highest civilian honor for life-saving action. His words carried the weight of command and gratitude. You didn't hesitate. You didn't second-guess yourself. You acted with the authority of someone who'd held lives in her hands 1,000 times before. The CEO unveiled a glass display case in the main lobby. Inside, Margaret's worn combat boots from Ramadi, sand still visible in the treads, positioned beneath a bronze plaque reading service above self, Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, USN, the Angel of Ramadi. Beside the boots, her nursing badge from Sacred Heart and a photograph of her treating casualties in a field hospital, her young face streaked with sweat and blood and purpose. The Iraqi interpreter embraced Margaret while news cameras recorded. He spoke in Arabic, then in English, thanking her for his brother's life, for her hands that had learned to save people before she learned to heal them. Margaret's son stood beside her, his eyes steady, no longer broken by the distance between them. She placed her hand on the glass case and felt the weight of 2 years of running, of hiding, of believing that survival meant disappearing. The plaque beneath her boots didn't read former anything. It read service. Present tense. Ongoing. The thing that didn't end when you took off the uniform because the uniform never really came off, it just changed fabric. The VA offered her a position training combat medics and corpsmen, using her Ramadi experience to teach trauma care to the next generation. She accepted, splitting time between Sacred Heart's ICU and military instruction. Nurses who'd gossiped about the quiet one in the corner started asking her questions. Veterans came to her locker looking for counsel. The disciplinary board where Hargrove had posted her humiliation now displayed her commendations. Someone spotted Dr. Hargrove 6 months after his conviction, teaching CPR certification classes at a community college in El Cajon, working for minimum wage, his medical license permanently revoked, facing federal prison once his plea was finalized. His reputation destroyed. His practice liquidated. His name become a cautionary tale whispered in medical ethics courses at every teaching hospital in California. Margaret walked the ICU halls without a limp now, new prosthetics, better fitted, pain managed, and stopped at the room where a young SEAL with blast injuries was being treated. She introduced herself with her full rank for the first time in 2 years. Her voice was different now. Lower. Certain. The voice of someone who'd stopped apologizing for being exactly who she was. True heroism isn't what you do when the world is watching. It's what you do when you're alone, carrying weight that no one else can see, and you choose to help anyway. It's the nurse in the corner. The interpreter who survived. The boots that held the line when everything else was collapsing. Subscribe for more stories about the people who serve in ways the world doesn't always recognize. Like and comment. Tell us about someone in your life whose strength you didn't see until they finally showed it. Because the quietest people in the room are often the ones holding everything together.